So this is our first attempt at a Bozboz video cast. So this is just going to be a quick chat to kind of talk about how the agency's coping with the current situation and a few thoughts about how brands might position themselves in the near future, what their sort of tone of voice might be, and so on. To introduce ourselves, so I'm Simon, I'm the MD here at Bozboz, and this is Matt.
How you doing?
Everybody, I'm good. Matt's a brand consultant and former employee of Bozboz. So let's just get cracking, shall we, Matt?
Yeah, I guess just to kick off, I just like, as an agency, how are you finding the whole remote working situation? I know a lot of businesses, there's a lot of logistical upheaval and disruption and, quickly switching into remote working mode. But as a sort of creative agency selling creative services, how have you kind of found that process, and how's it working out? What, 3-4 weeks into lockdown now?
I think it's been quite challenging, but to be fair, we're a digital agency, so we've always used kind of remote technology. We've had 1 or 2 remote employees for a long time anyway. Our systems guy, James, would only visit the office once every few months. So, he's full-time remote. So the kind of transition to becoming a fully remote agency hasn't been too bad. Like, it is what we kind of expected, but we're definitely learning things as this is happening. Like, every day we learn something new about how to get the best out of the technology or some of the challenges we're facing. I'm not sure who somebody kind of once said to me recently about this situation this is not parallel to normal remote working. So this kind of forced lockdown that we're all in is not what remote working businesses are normally like. I can tell you that you have agencies like Automatic who obviously make WordPress, a fully remote business. They have staff all around the world. And I kind of know how those guys operate. I've worked with them a lot in the past and met them at conferences and things like that. And they're really kind of social bunch, as most of us are. But having that kind of personal contact at conferences or going to client meetings and things like that, having that face-to-face is normally part of a remote working style. And currently we don't have that. So it's a completely different situation. We're all literally locked down. So some of it's going well, some of it I think is challenge, and I suspect everybody's like just missing that human contact.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, for myself, I'm a freelancer, so I was already quite used to working from home. So some of the basics, like, having a routine, get up, get dressed out of your pajamas in the morning, all that sort of like best practice for working from home, I was kind of already doing that. So that was pretty easy for me. But the other half of the week, I was working out of a sort of co-working space, and it's just having those, little conversations over a coffee, or, just bumping into someone and being like, what are you working on at the moment? What are you working on? And just having those sort of day-to-day interactions that you don't kind of get in this situation. Obviously, we're in the business of selling, creativity, creative solutions, and there's a process behind that. And some of the best creative ideas do come from those sort of little impromptu moments, maybe seeing something someone else is working on, or a little conversation in the kitchen. How do you think, are you finding workarounds to sort of ease that transition to a remote creative process where you've got different people in different locations?
Yeah. So again, difficult, but it's not that you can't really cope with it. So I think that, I've been a designer for many years now, and I can tell you from my own personal experience that when you're working in that kind of creative environment, it's very important to have a shared environment and to be able to kind of just like riff ideas off colleagues. And like you say, you might walk past somebody's screen and are like, oh, I love that, or just see inspiration anywhere in an office, or be chatting to a friend and then refer you to a website or some source of kind of content or visual content that really sparks the imagination. So there's a lot of that you miss, but designers, and I think most of them would agree, I don't want to speak for everybody, but a lot may agree that you kind of sometimes work collaboratively and then you go into silo mode. So a lot of people, like, you spend a certain period, like the ideation period, where you're working with colleagues and you're riffing ideas and you're having those conversations. And then there's a period of like, okay, just leave me to it for a while. I've got all these ideas down. I want to kind of thrash them out. I want to get them down on the page. And that, like, that part of the process is normally quite isolated anyway. But without the kind of beginning bit, that shared kind of collaborative ideation bit, it becomes a lot more difficult. So we're having to find ways to kind of get around that. So we're finding ourselves like spending more and more time on Zoom calls like this. You know, we're just like starting to have these conversations, like this conversation probably wouldn't have happened before, like over Zoom, but this is the way we're adapting to deal with it. So like, I guess that's just human nature, to just start just to adapt as quickly as possible.
Yeah. I'd agree with that 100%. And I'm loving the Zoom calls as well. I mean, and I'm finding as well, a lot of those, you know what it's like when you work in a business, when you work in an agency, there's a lot of meetings that maybe shouldn't happen or maybe run over a little bit. And I'm just finding, you know, people are looking forward to that contact on the Zoom calls. They're coming prepared. You know, it's normal best practice meeting stuff that we should all be doing all the time. But I'm just finding that, you know, that might just be me personally, but I'm getting so much more out of them, and they're actually being very productive, and people are coming ready to talk about what you're going on the call to talk about. So yeah, I mean, that's been a positive for me. Is just like, you know, when I'm having those conversations, they feel good, they feel meaningful. And, you know, even if it's just like, how are you doing? Are you well? Are you keeping all right today? Are you feeling positive? Like those sort of things. Yeah, I'm just getting more out of them and losing some of that sort of unnecessariness of some of the meetings you naturally have when you're working in-house at a business.
Yeah. I saw a stat, I think it was just this morning actually, on like, I got an email from an HR consultancy advising best ways to work, you know, to work remotely. And they were kind of, I think the stat was something like 13 or 14% like increase in productivity having remote calls for that reason. So, I mean, that's quite staggering really, like 14% productivity, because people come on calls prepared, knowing that, you know, what's you know, we don't need to waste our time. You need to be prepared. You need to kind of get to the point. So yeah, it's definitely, I think it's definitely good for productivity, but it's learning to use it socially as well. So I was talking to the team this morning, like we had a company stand up this morning, and we were talking about like, we're doing some great activities around kind of quizzes, and, you know, on Friday afternoon, everyone gets the chance to kind of just jump on a mass Zoom call and spend a bit of time together. And it's kind of just encouraging that a bit more, learning to use like these online tools socially, I think is probably something we hadn't anticipated so much.
Let's push on a little bit. So client-wise, I mean, obviously Bozboz work with a number of different clients in different sectors. So some people will be impacted in different ways from others. Some might be more busy than they've ever been. Some might be in sectors where, you know, essentially they're in the frozen state at the moment because they can't operate in the way they normally would. Some might be pivoting their strategy to be more online. You know, how are you kind of finding that client relationship? Are they embracing the sort of, you know, video conferencing element, and how are you keeping up those sort of client communications?
Yeah, I think we're doing quite well, and I think that pretty much all of our clients that I'm aware of anyway. So we have an account management team that's in constant contact with our clients. So you know, from what I can see going on, that we're doing well because everybody's in the same boat. I mean, that's the thing. I imagine if you were a remote agency and before this current crisis and insisting that like you did everything via Zoom calls, you might have got some pushback before. You know, people might prefer, I know certainly from my experience years back, that you'd have certain clients that really wanted that face-to-face time. And it's actually, and quite rightly so, it's part of, you know, a good agency, in my opinion, is getting that face time, getting to kind of know your clients really well. And there's nothing like, you know, a face-to-face meeting or going to somebody's office or bringing them to your office to learn a bit more. But the thing is, we're all in this boat together. Everybody's got to adjust. So I think the friction is really low. Like reaching out to clients and saying to them, yeah, let's have a call. It's really a question of what software you use more than anything, whether it's like...
Yeah. There's so many now. I've got like Skype, Zoom, House Party, Hangouts. Yeah.
I've not had a house party call with a client yet, but that might be a good idea.
No. Hey, that's more of a social thing. It's good. There's games and stuff in there, so if you want to, you know, lighten the tone a bit.
I'll give that a go. Yeah. But no, they've been really good, and we did a pitch earlier this week with a client that was a global client. They had two people, a person in London, two other people on the call in South Africa, one in Russia, and there were three of us, you know, in and around the Brighton area. But it was really smooth, you know, everybody knew what to do. Everybody was, you know, okay with the remote call. We managed to do a good presentation, a good pitch presentation. So I felt it was really, really successful, and it wasn't too difficult to achieve. So I kind of hope that is the way that things like go for the future. I'm not saying only do remote pitches. I hope we get the chance to kind of meet clients face to face in the future, but it does extend our reach, you know, as an agency, being able to kind of, you know, help work with businesses in internationally is absolutely where we want to be. Yeah.
Cool. And then I guess one of the things I wanted to talk about today was more, I guess a lot of people watching this as a business owner, as a brand manager, as a senior marketing person, you know, some people might be very clear on what their response is, both during this outbreak and in this post-COVID-19 world, that, you know, no one can honestly sit there and say they know exactly what that's going to look like. Yeah, and there's sort of different schools of thought emerging. But for those that are maybe uncertain how to respond, or just a little bit nervous, one of the things I wanted to talk about was sort of the role that brands and businesses play in this outbreak. Do they even play a role? You know, and if they do, what is that, and how do they go about sort of defining what that role is?
Well, I think they definitely play a role in the way that kind of society and the economy is going to deal with the outbreak, if that's the question is. Like, how do brands, you know, how can they react? I mean, firstly, like, brands, the term obviously is all encompassing, and different brands will have different messaging, they have different positioning, and so on and so forth. So I don't think there's like one way in which brands need to react, but everybody has a role in the way that we deal with this situation. Unfortunately, some brands have been hit really hard. You know, you know, certain industries like the travel industry, the hospitality industry, especially. But I mean, that's just scratching the surface. Everybody now, especially in lockdown. I mean, literally the high streets have been shut down. There are fashion brands going out of business left, right, and centre. So you're torn between this. Like, there's a lot of media out there talking to brands about how they should position themselves and what tone of voice to use. And I don't think it's universal advice. So I don't think that brands should always use that kind of empathetic, like, not everyone needs to default to that empathetic tone of voice. Like, if you are already there, if a brand is already like kind of mature enough that it promotes itself in a way that aligns with people's values and purposes, then it's not such a big change for them, you know. But if you have a brand that sells like, you know, like bargain basement household goods, then it would, to change your tone of voice to some sort of empathetic tone of voice to sell some basic kitchenware or something, it may not be appropriate, and it might be too much of an obvious move. So I think that's, you know, we have to all be cautious about changing our tone of voice too much in a reaction to the current situation. Like, we definitely have to have some empathy for the current situation and the way that consumers and people in general are, you know, behaving online, and the level at which they trust brands. But I think if you think about trust, you trust a brand or a person or anything partly because of consistency. You've gotten to know that person, that brand. You become to trust that they are, you know, they're for real. Like, and then if they suddenly change tacks, then it feels a little bit false. So
a bit forced.
Yeah, a bit forced. So I think brands need to be really careful about that. And it's a bit of a wake-up call for those brands that find themselves so out of like the current way of thinking. Then maybe that's a wake-up call for them to adjust long-term rather than it be a short-term reaction.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think I've probably spent half of my time quarantined at home looking for the unsubscribe button on emails that people just got it completely wrong, and, you know, big long form emails of, you know, we're here for you, and, you know, the whole empathy piece, which is fine. I'm not knocking it, because I understand why people are doing that, and it's coming from the very best of places, I'm sure, and, you know, that need of having to say something. But, you know, when it's coming from a stationery company that I bought some Sharpies and a thing of Post-its off 3 years ago, it just doesn't, the tone doesn't quite sit for me. So it's just like, you know, it's exactly what you're saying, is essentially coming back to your strategy. If you were doing those things before, you know, if that was your tone of voice before, then great, continue it. But if you weren't, don't try and shoehorn it in.
Yeah, it's just too obvious, and it's not genuine, is it? Like, so you need to have a long kind of think about your positioning and your tone of voice, if that's what's going on. But you know, like you say, in that example, if you bought a set of pencils off a company 3 years ago, then I'm not going to be insulted if you send me an offer for, you know, some pens at half price. I won't think you're taking advantage of the current situation. That's just what your business is, and I'll appreciate the offer. Yeah. I have seen, you know, I've seen one or two that have got it really wrong, and has sparked a reaction. I think within the first few weeks, I received an email from an external SEO supplier that was basically showed a chart of which industries were suffering and which were, you know, doing better in this current climate, and basically saying, right, shift, you know, dump this industry, you need to now concentrate on this here, and basically saying dump hospitality and travel and tourism, you know, concentrate on finance. And I've just found it, you know, mildly insulting, really, that we would be expected to just ditch all our clients and move to a completely different kind of vertical because of this situation. It actually sparked anger in me for that particular email. So yeah, people, you know, brands do need to be careful about the way that
I think, you know, and it's not rocket science. It's just, before you do anything, filter it through a lens. Like, make sure you're not being tone deaf. Do you know what I mean? And if there were things you were planning to do before and you think that they're still relevant and valuable to people and genuinely helpful, great, but just give it that double check, triple check, to just make sure that it isn't being tone deaf and it's being sensitive to the situation. If you think it's fine, then go. But, you know, to just that sort of scattergun approach, you know, you don't want to be sparking emotions like that in people.
Yeah.
You mentioned trust a couple of times. I think I was reading, I think you shared it with me actually, the Edelman trust Barometer report specifically focused on COVID-19. If anyone doesn't know what the Edelman Trust Barometer is, it's an annual piece of research done by the PR firm Edelman that looks at the relationship between consumers and brands, and focuses quite specifically on trust and whether consumers trust brands and the behaviours they sort of expect them to display. And they did quite a fast turnaround piece of research. I think they spoke to 12,000 people across 12 different countries or something, and they were asking them about questions like, how do you expect brands to behave at this time, and whether their behaviours now will impact your trust in that brand longer term. Did you read that report as well, did you?
Yeah, it was quite extensive, but I read most of it, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the general crux of it, at least what they were kind of taking from the data, was that firstly, people do expect brands to show up in some element and to help with this situation in a way that's kind of natural and plays on their core strengths, whatever they do. But the other finding was that people's responses and the appropriateness of those responses will have a long-term impact on not only trust, but people's buying decisions and whether they will be likely to buy from that brand, that business again in the future over the longer term.
Yeah, I think the report, it was definitely interesting. It cemented that idea of how important trust was. Now we've known this for a long time in the kind of marketing world, and there are many techniques in which you can use kind of like things like reviews and things like that to kind of help establish trust, like peer reviews and so on. But yeah, what I found interesting about that report was I kind of made a connection to the way that the media is reacting to the issue of brand trust. So it seems to me, it might just be me, but I feel like I'm reading more and more stories about either brands succeeding or failing during these times. Like everything that you seem to read about a particular brand is influential to how consumers think about that brand. So some of the papers are kind of doing reports on how successful certain brands have been during this period, whether or not they're genuinely supporting the NHS efforts, for example, or whether, they're also calling out brands that are basically, kind of just doing this for self-satisfaction, or that, self-fulfillment rather.
Yeah.
So it seems like the spotlight is on a test. Like brands are now, people are judging them. Like it's conversation that's happening in and amongst our peers at work and my friends and so on. And I'm hearing about fashion brands going under, or they're trying certain campaigns that are failing miserably, or certain brands that are actually kind of doing it well and it's coming across well. But it feels like everyone's going under a test now. So if you're a big brand with lots of followers, like the spotlight's on you to do it right, and it's more intense, that spotlight, than it's ever been before. So it's definitely that Edelman report. It was quite clear about how many people would be influenced in these current times. It was quite clear about statistics around people choosing to literally ditch a brand. They were saying there's X amount of people will no longer be faithful for that brand because of the way they're acting during this.
Yeah, I think something like 30% of the respondents said that they've already, I think they used the word punished, but I'm guessing that by that they mean boycotted or stopped buying or switched to another brand, which is quite early days. I mean, there is another school of thought which says that there's so much uncertainty and there's so much sort of emotion and fear and stuff going on at the moment that a survey respondent might not know how they're going to behave in a month, 2 months, 6 months time. If and I think a lot of it comes back to how long this lasts. If in a few weeks' time, things are getting better and there's vaccines on the way and, people can see light at the end of the tunnel, then, you know, these things that they're saying now they might revert back to normal behavior much more quickly, whereas the longer it goes on, you know, the bigger the sort of trauma from the event, the more likely they are to hold on to these negative emotions that they've got about brands or perceived inappropriateness of a brand's response now.
Yeah, I read an article, I think it was in PR Week, that was talking about the same subject, referring to, like, it's interesting when you think about kind of paid, owned and earned media and how they often, you know, you would have sort of different messaging kind of strategies across those different channels. And you think about paid media is often has more of a sales tone of voice, generally, not always, but more of a sales tone of voice, you know, more direct in terms of like offers and so on to the consumers. And then like owned media tends to be more informative. So if it's on a brand's own platform, for example, we're talking about their blog or other sorts of resources, you know, when you're reading blogs, they tend to be informative, or white papers, that type of thing. And when you think about those two different strategies, like one is very much more brazen than the other. And I feel like the general kind of way that things are going are towards the information led. So if you're not really sure, you know, I guess my advice to brands are, if they're not really sure what to do, then think about how they use their owned media, like what tone of voice they used in owned media, and it's much more informative, less salesy, and you know, and think about broadening that marketing strategy across all different media channels. Like I would say that that's probably a kind of safe way to go. It's genuine, it's informative, it's what people need right now. You know, people are showing resistance to more sales-led advertising.
I think you made a point earlier as well, and I think it's relevant to this. I think from a tone perspective, that's 100%. I would agree with that. I think as well, it's looking at your own, you know, and this is just basic strategy principles, is like knowing your own category and sort of auditing, assessing what the impacts are for your specific sector, because it's going to be very different from one industry to the next in terms of you know, if it's an essential item, if it's an essential service that people genuinely need, like a food manufacturer or something like that, then people are going to be receptive to sales messages because they genuinely want to access those items now. If it's something, you know, maybe just about home entertainment or you know, if you're in an industry that's kind of frozen, can't operate right now, like a travel company or something like that, then the way you can help is through information and, you know, guidance and giving people content that's going to, you know, even if it's just making people less bored whilst they're stuck at home for 2-3 months, however long this lasts for, then that's the role you should play. But if you're that company, don't go in with hard sales communications. That's just not going to be right. So yeah, it's just coming back to that, you know, it's hard at these times to be strategic, but it's the basic principles, you know, what's going on in your category, what are your customers feeling right now, what do you offer them that could be genuinely valuable for them at this time?
Yeah, and you know, there's an argument, there's an online discussion, shall we say, going on about whether brands should be like investing in their advertising at the moment, or their kind of promotion at the moment. And on one side of the argument, you've got like ad agencies and advertising platforms saying, you've got to keep going, you know, they're obviously. And then on the other side, there's financial constraints. You know, if those businesses don't have the revenue that they normally would have, then they have to kind of seriously consider the impact of the business. You know, it'd be insane to kind of probably run the same kind of aggressive marketing when your audience is just not there or unable to react to it, you know. So you have to think about both sides of the argument. And again, I don't think there's one answer for everybody. I think going completely dark is probably not a wise move, just to kind of switch off 100% of your advertising or your social is probably not a great move. I think brands need to like consider keeping keeping themselves present and keeping themselves in front of their audience, because we have to be optimistic that this situation will not last forever, and it stands to reason that the economy will start to, that there'll be a boost when lockdown kind of is over. We would expect people to kind of want to get out and re-engage with consumerism. They're going to want to go shopping again. They're going to want to go on holidays again. Everyone might be a little bit more cautious about their spend. And I'm not saying the economy is going to recover to where it was prior, but if you completely disappear off the radar, that doesn't sound like a particularly sound move to me. So I think we've got to find, somewhere in between.
Yeah, sure. And as the sort of immediate, very severe and tragic short-term health crisis kind of subsides a bit and we move forward, I think most people are in agreement now that we'll be going into some sort of recessionary period, how sort of long that is. Again, there's many different schools of thought, but part of our job as marketers, and I think you touched on this earlier when you talked about the role that brands play, is to keep that economy going and to, keep our businesses sustainable and moving forward, for society, for our employees, for all of that stuff. So I think that's where, as we move into that phase where we're coming out of this and we're resembling we're going back to some sort of resemblance of normality, whatever that looks like, that's where, people need to be ready to sort of activate and start, brand building again and turning those things back on, or at least dialing them up if they've remained on throughout.
Yeah, this whole like ecosystem that we live in, and it's at a delicate point right now. But I don't think there's anybody that really wants it to be like this. Nobody wants businesses to close down. We don't want empty shops and empty high streets, and we don't want people being made redundant and so on. So I think that the country or the world as a whole wants to get back to some sense of normality. It'll never be the same, but I do feel like we need to keep the lights on while this is happening and be prepared for business as usual, I guess. I mean, that's what I kind of hope for. I hope that we come out of this something that resembles normality, but is something different. We don't really know exactly what the world's going to look like afterwards, but I think we've all learned what's really important to us over these last few weeks. So I think there's bound to be a complete change in the way that people are spending their money on or offline, etc. So yeah, like you say, we've all got a part to play in this and keep the wheels turning.
Just because I'm semi-conscious of time, but just to sort of wrap up, you mentioned just there, there's bound to be some changes. Again, no one knows exactly what those changes will be. Lots of people say they know exactly, but none of us can be quite certain. But just in your opinion, in terms of trends moving forward, is there anything that sort of jumps out at you at the moment of things that you think, oh yeah, I can see that big change either in consumer behaviour or maybe sectors that you think are going to do really well, or is there anything that sort of jumps out at you at the moment that you think will stick moving forward?
Oh, yeah. So I think that the kind of irony that like these workspaces, the kind of co-working spaces, there was a real growth in that recently, and a lot of people were beginning to understand what it felt like to go and like have that shared office space. We've got a great place in Brighton, Platform 9, or there's WeWorks, or I forget what the other one's called. But there's a trend to move to work in these type of places, and I've experienced it myself, and they are fantastic places to work. But then all of a sudden, like lockdown happens, and they are one of the most public places you could be. So they're like kind of medically the worst place that you really want to be for your health. But then when that changes, I actually think they will bounce back really quick. And I think people have learned from this experience that remote working is a way forward. And I think we'll start to see changes in the way that businesses treat their own offices. And I feel like we might not start to see a sort of slightly different dynamic where they're using offices as hubs as opposed to a main office. So if you've got 100 people, maybe it'll only accommodate 30, and then, go down to and just be used kind of incrementally.
I think there's a few like that, and I think these are trends that were probably already happening, but like a catalyst like this just really accelerates those. Things like people using live streaming, adoption of e-commerce, you've just talked about remote working. All of those were things that were happening already. This might just really speed them along and accelerate those changes. Okay, cool. We're gonna wrap up from there.
So just before we go, it would be awesome to get some either feedback on this recording, or some ideas for our next recording. Like, we're just thrashing out what we might be talking about in the future. So if you've got any ideas or want to chat to us, or do contact us, ask@bozboz.co.uk or on Twitter @bozboz. So, but yeah, it'd be great to hear your thoughts. So thanks for listening.
Thanks, Simon. Cheers.
Okay, bye-bye.